The old pickup truck rattled to a stop at the edge of nowhere, dust swirling around its worn tires like ghosts refusing to settle. Sarah Chun pressed her forehead against the passenger window, watching the Colorado mountains stretch endlessly. Before her, their peaks sharp against the dying light. She'd driven 1,200 miles to reach this place, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, $300 in cash, and scars that ran deeper than skin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, as sharp and cutting as the day she'd left Boston. Hide your scars, Sarah. Nobody wants to see what broke you. But sitting there in that borrowed truck, looking up at mountains that wore their own scars, proudly avalanche paths carved into their sides, rock slides painting their faces with stories of survival, Sarah wondered if maybe her mother had been wrong about everything. Sarah had always been good at hiding things. Growing up in the narrow brownstone on Beacon Hill, she'd learned to tuck away her feelings like clothes in an overstuffed drawer, pressing down hard until everything fit into the space her mother deemed acceptable. The house itself was a monument to perfection: cream walls unmarked by fingerprints, hardwood floors that gleamed under carefully positioned lights, furniture arranged with mathematical precision. It was the kind of home that appeared in magazines, the kind that made neighbors pause during evening walks to peer through windows at a life that seemed effortlessly beautiful. Margaret Chun had built this facade with the dedication of an architect, and she expected her daughter to maintain it with equal precision. "Appearances matter, Sarah," she would say while smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her daughter's school uniform. "The world judges us by what they see first. Make sure they see strength, not weakness." The first scar had appeared when Sarah was 7, a thin line across her palm from a fall in the playground. She'd run home crying, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage her teacher had wrapped around her hand. Instead of comfort, she'd found her mother waiting with hydrogen peroxide and a lecture about being more careful. "Scars tell people you're clumsy," Margaret had said, dabbing the wound with clinical efficiency. "They tell people you can't take care of yourself." By the time Sarah turned 16, she had collected more scars: a crescent-shaped mark on her knee from learning to skateboard in secret, a small burn on her wrist from cooking dinner when her mother worked late, tiny lines on her fingers from her hidden hobby of wood carving. Each mark told a story of curiosity, of trying, of living. But under her mother's critical gaze, they became symbols of failure, evidence that she wasn't careful enough, wasn't perfect enough, wasn't enough. The worst scar, though, wasn't visible on her skin. It lived in the hollow space behind her ribs, carved there by years of swallowing words she wanted to say, dreams she wanted to chase, feelings she wanted to express. By 18, Sarah had become a master of concealment. Foundation covered the small marks on her arms. Long sleeves hid the rest. She learned to speak in careful, measured sentences that revealed nothing of substance. She chose safe majors, safe friends, safe choices that would never lead to the kind of stories that left marks. College at Harvard had been her mother's dream realized through her daughter's compliance. Sarah studied economics because it was practical, dated William Morrison because he came from the right family, and planned a future that looked exactly like the life her mother had scripted for her. She moved through those 4 years like a ghost of herself, earning good grades and checking off boxes, while the real Sarah, the one who wanted to travel and create, and maybe even fail spectacularly at something meaningful, remained buried under layers of expectation. The engagement to William had been as predictable as sunrise. He proposed on a Thursday evening in November, at the same restaurant where they'd had their first official date 3 years earlier. The ring was exactly what her mother would have chosen: traditional, expensive, completely devoid of personality. Sarah said yes because it was expected, because it fit the plan, because the alternative would have required explaining why she felt nothing when she looked at this man. who was supposed to be her future. The wedding planning consumed the next year of her life like a benevolent cancer. Her mother approached it with military precision, booking venues and selecting flowers with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Sarah found herself swept along in the current of decisions that were made for her, about her, without her. The dress was chosen because it photographed well. The venue was selected for its prestige. The guest list grew to include people Sarah barely knew but who mattered to her mother's social circles. Through it all, Sarah felt herself disappearing. She would catch glimpses of her reflection in store windows and not recognize the woman looking back, perfectly put together, appropriately dressed, utterly hollow. Her real self had been compressed into something so small it could fit in the spaces between other people's expectations. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in April, exactly 6 weeks before the wedding. Sarah had been picking up her altered dress when she overheard 2 women talking in the shop's waiting area. One was describing her daughter's upcoming marriage to such a stable young man, and how relieved she was that the girl had finally learned to make smart choices instead of following her heart. The other woman laughed and said, "Thank goodness. Following your heart just leads to mistakes and regrets. Better to marry with your head." Something inside Sarah cracked when she heard those words. She thought about all the times she'd chosen safety over passion, comfort over adventure, approval over authenticity. She thought about the woodcarving tools hidden in her closet, the travel blogs she bookmarked in private, the paintings she wanted to create but never started. She thought about the woman she might have been if she hadn't spent so many years trying to become the woman everyone else wanted. That night, she sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by wedding presents and thank you cards she needed to write, and made a decision that terrified her more than any scar ever could. She opened her laptop and began typing a letter to William, then another to her mother, then a third to her boss at the consulting firm where she'd been working since graduation. She was resigning from her life, effective immediately. The confrontation with her mother had been brutal. Margaret had cycled through disbelief, anger, bargaining, and finally a cold fury that Sarah had never seen before. "You're throwing away everything I've worked to give you," she'd said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "For what? Some fantasy about finding yourself? You'll come crawling back when you realize how hard the world is for people who don't have a plan." But Sarah was done with plans that weren't her own. She returned the ring to William, who seemed more relieved than heartbroken. She donated the wedding dress to a charity shop. She sold most of her furniture and packed her life into boxes that fit easily in the back of her Honda Civic. Her bank account held exactly $3,247, not enough for most people to consider starting over, but enough for her to buy time to figure out what came next. The decision to drive west had been impulsive. She'd been scrolling through job listings in various cities, trying to figure out where someone with her skills, but no clear direction, might land, when she'd seen a posting for a bookstore manager in Cedar Ridge, Colorado. Population 2,800, nestled in the Rocky Mountains. Seeking someone with business experience, who wasn't afraid of small-town life and long winters. Something about that job posting had spoken to her in a way that nothing had in years. Maybe it was the honesty of admitting the winters were long, or the fact that they were looking for someone unafraid rather than someone perfect. Maybe it was simply that Cedar Ridge was as far from Beacon Hill as she could imagine getting while still remaining in the same country. She'd applied on a whim, using her real email address for the first time in months instead of the professional one her mother had helped her create. To her surprise, the owner, a woman named Ruth Blackwood, had called her the next day. Their conversation had been unlike any job interview Sarah had ever experienced. Ruth had asked about her favorite books, whether she minded dogs in the workplace, and if she was running toward something or away from something. When Sarah had answered honestly away from something, definitely away, Ruth had laughed and said, "Good. People running toward something sometimes don't know when to stop. People running away from something usually know exactly what they don't want. The job is yours if you want it. The drive to Colorado had taken her 3 days. She'd stopped at roadside diners and slept in cheap motels, gradually shedding the careful persona she'd maintained for so long. By the time she crossed the Colorado state line, she'd stopped checking her appearance in mirrors and started rolling down the windows to feel the wind. Her hair, usually styled into smooth submission, had grown wild and free. Her hands, uncovered by the professional manicures her mother insisted upon, showed the calluses from packing boxes and the small cuts from hurried cleaning. Cedar Ridge appeared around a bend in the mountain road like something from a postcard, if postcards were honest about the way real places looked when they'd been weathered by actual life. The main street stretched for exactly 6 blocks, lined with buildings that had clearly seen better decades, but wore their age with dignity. The bookstore sat between a hardware store and a cafe, its painted sign faded but readable. Blackwood. Books and more. Ruth Blackwood turned out to be a woman in her 70s with silver hair that refused to be tamed and eyes that seemed to see everything. She greeted Sarah at the store's front door with a cup of coffee and an immediate tour that revealed the more. In the store's name included a small cafe, a repair shop for electronics, and a corner dedicated to local art and crafts. Small towns require businesses to wear multiple hats, Ruth explained as she showed Sarah the apartment above the store that came with the job. People need books, but they also need their phones fixed and a place to buy birthday gifts and somewhere to sit when they want to complain about their neighbors. We provide full service here. The apartment was small but filled with light from windows that looked out over the mountains. It had hardwood floors marked by decades of use, walls painted a warm yellow that seemed to capture and hold sunshine, and furniture that had clearly been collected over time rather than purchased as a set. It was the opposite of everything Sarah had grown up with, and she loved it immediately. The previous tenant left some things behind, Ruth said, opening a closet to reveal a collection of outdoor gear, hiking boots, rain jackets, camping equipment. Feel free to use whatever fits. The mountains aren't forgiving to people who aren't properly equipped, but they're generous to those who are. Sarah had moved in that very afternoon, carrying her few belongings up the narrow stairs that creaked with each step. For the first time in her adult life, she fell asleep in a bed she'd chosen, in a room that was entirely hers, listening to sounds she didn't recognize wind through pine trees, the distant call of an owl, the settling of a building that had stories built into its very foundation. The next morning, she'd woken before dawn to find the world outside her windows transformed. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the town in a blanket of white that made everything look new. She'd pressed her face against the glass like a child, watching the way the early light turned the snow pink and gold, and realized she was crying, not from sadness but from something she couldn't name. Relief, maybe. Or possibility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Working at Blackwood Books proved to be unlike any job she'd ever had. The customers were as varied as the merchandise ranchers looking for repair manuals, teenagers seeking romance novels, elderly couples browsing travel guides for places they'd always meant to visit. Sarah found herself becoming a confidant to people who treated the bookstore like a community center, sharing their joys and sorrows over coffee while she rang up their purchases. Ruth proved to be a mentor, unlike any Sarah had ever encountered. Instead of giving direct advice, she asked questions that made Sarah think. Instead of criticism, she offered observations that helped Sarah see herself more clearly. When Sarah expressed anxiety about not having a long-term plan, Ruth had said, "Plans are useful for some things and useless for others. You can't plan your way into becoming who you're meant to be. That requires patience and willingness to be surprised by yourself. The months passed with a rhythm Sarah had never experienced. She worked in the bookstore during the day, learning about inventory and customer service and the delicate art of recommending books to people, based on conversations rather than algorithms. In the evenings, she explored the town and the surrounding mountains, gradually building up her endurance for longer hikes and developing relationships with neighbors who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than her achievements. She began to notice changes in herself that went beyond the obvious ones. The way her skin had tanned from spending time outdoors, how her hands had grown stronger from lifting boxes and operating the old cash register. More significantly, she found herself speaking more honestly, laughing more freely, sleeping more deeply. The constant anxiety that had been her companion for years began to fade, replaced by something she eventually recognized as contentment. But the real transformation began the day she met Thomas Bear Kowalski, though she wouldn't understand the significance of that meeting until much later. It was early October, and Sarah had been in Cedar Ridge for almost 6 months. She'd grown confident in her role at the bookstore and had started to feel like she truly belonged in the small mountain community. The first snowfall of the season brought Thomas Kowalski down from his cabin in the high country, though nobody in Cedar Ridge called him Thomas anymore. To them, he was simply Bear, a name earned through decades of living in the wilderness that surrounded their small town like a protective embrace. At 6 feet 4 inches, with shoulders that could carry a full pack through terrain that broke lesser men, he moved through the world with the careful grace of someone who understood that survival depended on respecting both your own limits and the power of the natural world around you. Bear had been living alone in the mountains for 17 years, ever since the day he'd walked away from everything that had once defined him. The cabin he called home sat at 9,000 feet elevation, accessible only by a trail that discouraged casual visitors and eliminated the unprepared entirely. It was exactly where he wanted to be, far enough from civilization to avoid the complications that came with other people's expectations, close enough to town that he could resupply when necessary and help his neighbors when they needed someone. With his particular skills, those skills had been hard-earned through years of making mistakes that could have killed him and learning from each one until he became someone the mountains couldn't break. He knew how to read weather patterns 3 days out by the way clouds gathered around certain peaks. He could track animals through snow so fresh it still held the scent of the sky it had fallen from. He understood which plants would heal and which would harm, where to find water when the obvious sources ran dry, how to build shelter that would hold against winds that could strip bark from trees. But more than technical knowledge, Bear had developed something rarer, the ability to be comfortable with silence, with solitude, with the long conversations a person had with themselves when there was nobody else around to hear them. He'd learned to listen to the stories the mountains told through the language of seasons and storms. And in return, he'd learned to tell his own story honestly, without the editing that other people's presence seemed to require. The scars that mapped his body were part of that honest storytelling. A twisted line across his left shoulder marked the place where a grizzly had reminded him that being alone in the wilderness meant accepting that you weren't always at the top of the food chain. The network of small marks on his hands spoke of years spent working with tools and fire and sharp things that demanded respect. A longer scar along his right forearm told the story of the avalanche that had nearly taken him during his 3rd winter alone, when overconfidence had almost made him another cautionary tale whispered around town. Each mark was a lesson learned, a story survived, evidence that he'd chosen a life that left traces on his skin, but had somehow healed the deeper wounds that had driven him to the mountains in the first place. Unlike most people, Bear wore his scars without shame or explanation. They were simply part of who he had become, no different from the weathered lines around his eyes or the calluses on his palms. His monthly trips to Cedar Ridge followed a pattern established through years of routine. He would arrive just after dawn, His old truck loaded with items he'd crafted during the long months alone, furniture carved from deadfall timber, knives forged in his workshop, sometimes pelts from animals he'd hunted for food. The extra income from selling these items kept him supplied with coffee, kerosene, and the few manufactured goods his mountain life required. But this October morning felt different from the moment he drove down Main Street. The town looked the same, 6 blocks of buildings that had weathered decades of mountain winters with stubborn persistence, but something in the rhythm of the place had shifted. It took him several minutes to identify what had changed, and when he did, it surprised him. There was laughter coming from Blackwood Books, genuine laughter that rose and fell like music. Bear had known Ruth Blackwood for 15 years, since she'd been the first person in Cedar Ridge to treat him like a neighbor rather than a curiosity. She was one of the few people in town who understood that choosing solitude wasn't the same as running away from life. It was simply a different way of engaging with it. But Ruth's laughter had always been quieter, more contained. This was something new, something that made him curious despite his general policy of avoiding other people's business. He parked his truck outside the hardware store and began unloading his monthly offerings, 3 chairs he'd spent August carving from pine that had been seasoned by 2 winters of mountain weather, a set of kitchen knives forged from reclaimed steel, and a small table that had taken him most of September to complete. Jim Harrison, who owned the hardware store, helped him carry everything inside, chatting about the early snow and whether it meant they were in for a harder winter than usual. "You should stop by Ruth's place while you're in town," Jim said as they arranged the furniture in the store's front display. "She's got someone new working with her. Nice girl from back east who seems to be settling in well." Bear nodded politely but didn't commit to anything. He'd learned to be cautious around Ruth's enthusiasms, which sometimes included attempts to draw him more fully into the town's social fabric. He appreciated her intentions, but he'd chosen his level of engagement deliberately, and saw no reason to change it. After finishing his business at the hardware store and picking up supplies at the general store, Bear found himself standing outside Blackwood Books despite his intentions to head straight back up the mountain. The October afternoon was growing short, and he had a 2-hour drive ahead of him, but something kept him paused on the sidewalk, listening to the sounds drifting through the store's windows. There were voices inside, Ruth's familiar cadence, mixing with someone younger, someone who spoke with the quick rhythm of cities but had already begun to slow into the more measured pace of mountain conversation. They were discussing books, but not in the academic way that made literature feel like homework. Instead, they talked about stories the way Bear thought about trails, as pathways that led somewhere worth going, even when you weren't sure of the destination. He pushed open the door, setting off the small bell that announced customers, and stepped into warmth, scented with coffee and wood smoke from the small fireplace Ruth kept burning during the cooler months. The store looked exactly as it always had, books arranged more by intuition than any system, comfortable chairs scattered throughout, local artwork covering the walls, but the energy inside felt completely different. "Bear!" Ruth's voice carried genuine delight as she emerged from behind the counter. Perfect timing. "Sarah, come meet the most interesting hermit in Colorado." The woman who appeared from between the shelves was not what Bear had expected, though. He couldn't have said what he'd been expecting. She was small and dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once without making judgments about what they saw. Her clothes were practical jeans and a sweater that had clearly been chosen for comfort rather than fashion, but it was her hands that caught his attention. They were the hands of someone who worked with them, marked by small cuts and calluses that spoke of recent learning rather than lifelong labor. "Sarah Chun," she said, extending one of those interesting hands. "Ruth's told me about you. She says you're the person to ask about hiking trails that won't kill beginners." Her directness surprised him. Most people in Cedar Ridge had learned to approach him obliquely, as if his preference for solitude might be contagious. But this woman Sarah seemed to understand instinctively that he appreciated honesty more than diplomacy. "Depends on how you define beginner," he replied, accepting her handshake and finding her grip firm without being performative, "and what you consider an acceptable risk of death." She laughed, and Bear realized this was the laughter he'd heard from the street. It was unguarded in a way that suggested she hadn't always felt free to laugh like that, which made him curious about her story in spite of himself. "I've been hiking the easier trails around town since spring," Sarah said. "But I'd like to go higher before the snow makes everything impossible." Ruth suggested you might have recommendations. Bear found himself studying her more carefully then. He usually studied people. There was something in the way she carried herself that reminded him of animals he'd encountered in the wild, alert, but not fearful, ready to move quickly if necessary, but not actively expecting danger. It was the posture of someone who had learned to be cautious without becoming paralyzed by caution. "High country's not forgiving to people who don't respect it," he said, which was his standard response to requests for trail information, usually. This was enough to discourage all but the most determined hikers, but Sarah simply nodded. "I'm learning to respect a lot of things I used to take for granted," she said. The mountains seemed like a good place to continue that education. There was something in the way she said it that made Bear look at her more closely. He'd spent enough years alone with his thoughts to recognize when someone else was working through their own complicated relationship with themselves. Sarah had the particular stillness that came from recent transformation, the careful way of moving through the world that people developed when they were still figuring out who they were becoming. "Ruth," he said without taking his eyes off Sarah, "you mind if I borrow your new employee for a few hours?" "Only if you promise to bring her back in one piece," Ruth replied. But her tone suggested she'd been hoping for exactly this development. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Are you asking if I want to go hiking with someone I met 3 minutes ago?" "I'm asking if you want to learn something about the mountains from someone who's made most of the mistakes you could make and lived to tell about them," Bear corrected. "The trail I'm thinking of is 3 miles up and 3 miles back. Nothing technical, but it'll show you what high country looks like when the snow starts to stick." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Bear found himself genuinely curious about what she was thinking. Most people would have either jumped at the chance or immediately declined based on social conventions about strangers and safety. But Sarah seemed to be having a more complex internal conversation. "I don't have proper gear," she said finally. "Ruth's got a spare pack and jacket that should fit." "Boots?" Sarah lifted one foot to show him hiking boots that were clearly well used, but well maintained. The previous tenant left these. "Then we're set, unless you're not interested." "I'm interested," Sarah said, and Bear believed her. "But I should probably mention that I'm not great with heights. This trail doesn't have any significant exposure. Worst case scenario, you see some pretty country and get tired. Best case, you figure out whether you want to go higher." 20 minutes later, they were walking up a trail that switched back through aspen groves already turning gold with autumn's touch. Sarah had moved with careful efficiency as she'd borrowed gear from Ruth's collection, asking practical questions about layering and water and how to tell if weather was moving in. Bear had found himself impressed by the quality of her questions. They were the kind of questions asked by someone who understood that not knowing something wasn't shameful, but not asking about it could be dangerous. The trail climbed steadily through forest that grew thicker as they gained elevation. Bear set a pace that challenged without overwhelming, occasionally pointing out signs that most people would miss, tracks in the soft earth, trees marked by bears, the subtle changes in vegetation that indicated shifts in elevation and moisture. Sarah absorbed these lessons with the focused attention of a good student, asking follow-up questions that showed she was thinking about what she was learning, rather than simply collecting information. They'd been hiking for about an hour when Sarah stopped abruptly, her attention caught by something off the main trail. Bear followed her gaze and saw what had captured her interest, a massive pine that had been struck by lightning sometime in the past year. The tree was still standing, but the lightning had carved a spiral scar down its trunk, leaving a twisted ribbon of exposed wood that gleamed silver-white against the dark bark. "It's still alive," Sarah said, moving closer to examine the scar. "How is it still alive with damage like that?" Bear joined her beside the tree, running his hand along the lightning scar with the familiarity of someone who had seen many such wounds. Trees are tougher than they look. Lightning rarely kills them outright. It might take years for this one to decide whether it's going to die or adapt to what happened to it. Sarah traced the path of the scar with her eyes, following its spiral course from the tree's crown down to where it disappeared into the forest floor. "My mother would have said the lightning ruined it, made it ugly and weak." "Your mother sounds like someone who didn't spend much time around trees," Bear replied. "This scar is going to be part of this tree's story for the rest of its life. Could make it stronger in some ways, weaker in others. Definitely makes it more interesting to look at." He watched Sarah's face as she processed this, seeing something shift in her expression that suggested they weren't really talking about trees anymore. It was a look he recognized from his own mirror during the early years in the mountains, when he'd been learning to separate the stories other people told about scars from the stories the scars themselves actually told. November arrived in Cedar Ridge with the kind of storm that reminded everyone why the town's population stayed small. Snow fell for 3 straight days, transforming familiar landmarks into alien geography and turning simple tasks like getting to work into exercises in determination. Sarah woke on the 3rd morning to find her apartment windows completely covered by snow that had been driven horizontal by winds that sounded like freight trains. When they hit the building, the bookstore remained closed for 2 days, the first time Ruth had shut down for weather in over a decade. But rather than feeling trapped, Sarah discovered something unexpected in the enforced solitude. For the first time since leaving Boston, she had days with no external demands, number schedule to maintain, no one to please or impress. She spent hours sitting by her window, watching the storm reshape the world outside, while she worked on a wood carving project that had been calling to her since her hike with Bear. The carving was supposed to be simple, just a small relief of the lightning-scarred tree they'd encountered on the trail. But as she worked, the piece had evolved into something more complex. Her inexperienced hands, guided by instincts she hadn't known she possessed, were creating something that captured not just the tree's appearance, but its essence, the way it had worn its wound like a badge of survival rather than shame. When the storm finally broke, Sarah emerged from her apartment to find a world transformed. Main Street lay under 4 feet of snow that sparkled in the late afternoon sun like crushed diamonds. The familiar shapes of buildings and cars had become soft sculptures, and the silence was so complete it seemed to ring in her ears. She was standing on her small balcony, breathing air so cold it made her lungs ache, when she spotted Bear's truck moving slowly down the street. He parked outside the bookstore and climbed out carrying something wrapped in canvas. Even bundled in winter gear, his movements had the same careful economy she remembered from their hike. Nothing wasted, everything purposeful. He knocked on the bookstore's door, waited, then looked up and spotted her watching from above. "Sarah!" His voice carried clearly in the thin air. "Ruth around?" "She went to Denver to check on her sister," Sarah called back. "Won't be back until tomorrow. Store is closed." Bear stood in the street for a moment, apparently considering this information. Then he held up the canvas-wrapped bundle. "I brought something for her. Mind if I come up and leave it with you?" 10 minutes later, Bear was standing in her small apartment, looking around with the same careful attention he'd given to the trail during their hike. His presence seemed to fill the space without overwhelming it, and Sarah found herself seeing her home through his eyes. The books stacked on every available surface, the wood carving tools arranged on a makeshift workbench by the window, the Small attempts she'd made to create beauty in functional spaces. "This is good work," he said, examining the tree carving she'd left on the table. He held it with the respect of someone who understood the patience required to coax such details. "From raw wood. How long have you been carving?" "I started when I was 12, Sarah replied, surprised by her own honesty. "Had to do it in secret because my mother thought it was too messy, too unpredictable. I gave it up in college, then started again after I moved here." Bear turned the carving over in his hands, studying it from different angles. "Funny how some things wait for us until we're ready for them again." He unwrapped his own bundle to reveal a piece that made Sarah catch her breath, a carving of a mountain peak she recognized from their hike, but rendered with a level of detail that spoke of years of practice and intimate knowledge of the subject. Every ridge and shadow had been captured with precision, but more than that, the piece somehow conveyed the feeling of standing in that high country, the sense of space and possibility that came with being above the tree line. "This is incredible," Sarah said, accepting the piece when Bear offered it to her. "Ruth's going to love it. It's a commission. She asked me to carve something for the store's winter display." Bear paused, seeming to consider something. "Actually, she suggested I might want to show you some techniques. Said you were interested in learning more about working with wood." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety mixed with excitement, the feeling that came when opportunities presented themselves faster than she could analyze all the potential risks. The old Sarah would have found polite ways to decline would have worried about being good enough or prepared enough or worthy of someone's time and expertise. But the woman she was becoming had different instincts. "I'd like that," she said. "Though I should warn you, I'm still figuring out the difference between carving and just making expensive kindling." Bear's laugh was quiet but genuine. "Everyone makes expensive kindling when they're learning. The trick is making sure you learn something from each piece you ruin." They spent the next hour with Sarah's carving tools spread between them. Bear showing her how to read the grain of wood, the way he read weather patterns, looking for the subtle signs that indicated which direction a cut wanted to go, where the wood was likely to split, how to work with the material's natural tendencies, rather than fighting against them. "Wood has memory," he explained as he demonstrated a particular type of cut. "It remembers how it grew, what stressed it, where it was wounded, and how it healed. Good carving isn't about imposing your vision on the wood. It's about finding the story that's already there and helping it emerge." As Sarah practiced the techniques he showed her, their conversation gradually shifted from technical instruction to something more personal. Bear talked about his early years in the mountains, the mistakes he'd made when he thought he could bend the wilderness to his will instead of learning to work within its rules. Sarah found herself sharing stories about her childhood, about the disconnect between who she'd been expected to be and who she'd actually wanted to become. "I spent so many years trying to be perfect," she said as she worked on smoothing a particularly challenging section of her carving. "My mother made it clear that any visible flaw was a failure, that people would judge me based on anything that suggested I wasn't completely in control of my life." Bear was quiet for a long moment, his own hands busy with the delicate work of adding texture to a mountain face. "Control's an interesting thing," he said finally. "Spent my first winter up here, thinking I could control every variable, plan for every possibility. Nearly killed myself trying to outsmart an avalanche that I should have just avoided." He rolled up his sleeve to show her the scar she'd glimpsed during their hike, a twisted line of white tissue that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "This is what happened when I thought I knew better than the mountain. Took me 3 hours to dig myself out, another 6 to get to where someone could help me. Worst night of my life, but also the most educational." Sarah stopped carving to look at the scar properly. Unlike every other scar she'd ever seen, this one didn't make her feel uncomfortable or sorry for the person carrying it. Instead, it seemed like evidence of survival, proof that Bear had faced something terrible and come through it changed but intact. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Sometimes when the weather changes. But mostly it just reminds me that I'm not as smart as I think I am, and that's usually a useful thing to remember." Without quite meaning to, Sarah found herself rolling up her own sleeves. The small scars on her arms and hands were nothing compared to Bear's dramatic evidence of survival, but in the lamplight of her apartment, they seemed more significant than they ever had before. The crescent on her wrist from learning to cook, the network of tiny lines on her fingers from years of secret carving, the burn mark from a pottery class she'd taken in college and quit when her mother had called it impractical. Bear studied these marks with the same attention he'd given to her carving, not with pity or discomfort, but with genuine interest. "Each one's got a story," he said. "Not very dramatic stories," Sarah replied, suddenly self-conscious. "Drama's overrated. Most of the important stories are about small decisions to keep trying something, even when it's hard." He pointed to a particular scar on her thumb. "That one's from carving?" Sarah nodded. "First week I started again after moving here. I was trying to carve a bird and the knife slipped. Bled all over Ruth's kitchen while she bandaged me up and told me about all the scars she'd earned learning to bind books. And you kept carving?" "The next day. Ruth said the only way to honor a scar earned while learning was to make sure you learned something worth the price you paid." Bear smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "Ruth's got wisdom. Most people want to avoid getting marked by their experiences. They miss the fact that unmarked usually means untested." As the evening progressed, their conversation ranged across topics that Sarah had never discussed with anyone: the difference between loneliness and solitude, the way that physical challenges could teach emotional lessons, the strange freedom that came from accepting that you couldn't control how others perceived your choices. Bear shared stories from his years in the mountains with the same casualness that other people talked about their commutes to work, but each anecdote revealed layers of hard-won understanding about resilience and adaptation. "The animals up there teach you things you can't learn anywhere else," he said as they took a break from carving to make coffee. "Watch a deer that survived multiple winters, and you'll see something that knows the difference between being careful and being paralyzed by fear. They're alert to danger, but they don't let the possibility of danger stop them from living." Sarah found herself thinking about this as she watched snow continue to fall outside her windows. "I think I spent most of my 20s paralyzed by fear disguised as prudence. I called it being responsible, but really I was just terrified of making any choice that might leave a mark. And now?" Sarah considered the question while looking at her hands stained now with wood dust and small cuts from the evening's work, marked by months of learning to live differently than she'd been taught. "Now I'm starting to think that being unmarked might be the most dangerous way to live. How do you know what you can handle if you never test yourself against anything real?" Bear nodded slowly. "The mountains taught me that safety isn't about avoiding all risk. It's about developing the skills and judgment to handle the risks you choose to take. Someone who's never been tested in small ways isn't prepared when life tests them in big ways." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft whisper of blades against wood and the wind still moving snow around outside. Sarah found herself entering a state of focus she'd forgotten, existed completely absorbed in the immediate task of reading the wood's grain and responding to its subtle suggestions about where the next cut should go. It was nearly midnight when Bear finally packed up his tools and prepared to head back up to his cabin. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of crystalline clarity under stars that seemed close enough to touch. "This was good," he said as Sarah walked him down to his truck. "We should do it again." "I'd like that. Though next time, maybe I'll have figured out how to make something that actually resembles what I'm trying to carve." Bear paused with his hand on the truck door. "The lightning tree you're working on, it's not supposed to look like the actual tree. It's supposed to look like your understanding of what that tree means. Those are different things. As Sarah watched his taillights disappear up the mountain road, she found herself thinking about the difference between representation and interpretation, between copying something and understanding it deeply enough to translate its essence into a different form. She spent another hour working on her carving before finally going to bed, and when she did, she dreamed of trees that wore their scars, like jewelry, and mountains that told their stories through the language of seasons and storms. Winter deepened around Cedar Ridge like a slow-closing fist, and with it came a silence that Sarah had never experienced in the city. It wasn't simply the absence of traffic and sirens and the constant hum of 8 million people living in proximity. This was the profound quiet of a world locked under snow, where sound itself seemed muffled and distant, where the crack of expanding ice or the distant howl of coyotes carried for miles, through air so clear it made her lungs ache. Sarah's relationship with Bear had settled into a rhythm as natural as the seasons themselves. Every few weeks, he would appear in town with his truck loaded with handcrafted goods, and if Ruth didn't need her in the store, they would disappear into the mountains together. These excursions had evolved from simple hiking lessons into something more complex, expeditions that tested not just her physical endurance, but her willingness to trust herself in situations where hesitation could mean danger. Bear had proven to be a teacher unlike any she'd encountered in her formal education. He never lectured or insisted on specific outcomes. Instead, he would present her with challenges that seemed just beyond her current capabilities, then step back and let her figure out how to meet them. When she succeeded, he would simply nod and present the next challenge. When she failed, he would help her analyze what had gone wrong without making her feel diminished by the failure. On a bitter February morning, when the thermometer outside the bookstore read -15 degrees, Bear arrived in town earlier than usual. Sarah was opening the store, going through the ritual of starting the fire and checking that the pipes hadn't frozen overnight, when she heard his truck pull up outside. Through the frost-covered windows, she could see him sitting in the cab, not moving to get out, and something about his stillness made her abandon her morning routine to go outside. "Everything all right?" she asked, her breath creating clouds in the frigid air. Bear looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, a carefully controlled intensity that suggested he was working hard to contain something. "I need to show you something. But it's going to require a level of trust you might not be ready for." Sarah had learned to pay attention when Bear spoke with that particular tone. It usually meant he was about to push her toward an edge she hadn't known existed. What kind of trust? The kind where you don't ask questions until afterward. The kind where you follow my lead, even if what I'm asking doesn't make sense to you at the time. The old Sarah would have demanded explanations, would have needed to understand every variable before committing to anything. But the woman she'd become over the past months had learned to recognize the difference between reckless impulsivity and calculated risk. More importantly, she'd learned to trust Bear's judgment about what she could handle. "Let me get my gear," she said. An hour later, they were driving up a road that didn't appear on any map, a barely visible track that wound through forest so thick it blocked most of the winter light. Bear's truck climbed steadily for what felt like forever, the engine working hard against grades that seemed to grow steeper with each switchback. Sarah had stopped asking where they were going after the first few miles, partly because Bear had requested her trust, and partly because she was beginning to understand that the destination was less important than the journey itself. They finally stopped at what appeared to be the end of the world, a small clearing surrounded by peaks that rose so steeply they seemed to lean inward, creating a bowl of snow and rock and silence that felt completely separate from the human world below. Bear's cabin sat at the far edge of the clearing, built so skillfully into the landscape that it seemed to have grown there rather than being constructed. "Welcome to my place," Bear said. climbing out of the truck with movements that seemed more careful than usual. Sarah followed him toward the cabin, her eyes taking in details that revealed the thoughtfulness behind every aspect of its construction. The building was small but perfectly proportioned, built from logs that had been fitted together with joints so precise they required no visible hardware. Solar panels angled to catch the maximum winter light provided power for LED lights visible through windows that were positioned to frame specific views of the surrounding peaks. Smoke rose straight up from a chimney that suggested a fire burning efficiently within, but it wasn't the cabin itself that made Sarah catch her breath. It was the workshop that occupied a separate building nearby, its open doors revealing an interior that looked like a temple dedicated to the art of making beautiful things from raw materials. Workbenches held tools arranged with surgical precision. Half-finished furniture stood in various stages of completion. The walls were lined with examples of Bear's work that ranged from purely functional items to pieces that transcended craft and approached art. "This is what I needed you to see," Bear said, leading her into the workshop. "Not because I wanted to impress you, but because I wanted you to understand something about the relationship between hiding and revealing." He moved to a workbench where a piece of wood lay partially carved, a complex relief that depicted the same lightning-scarred tree Sarah had been working on, but rendered with a level of detail and emotional depth that made her own attempt look like a child's drawing. Every groove carved by the lightning was visible, but so was the new growth that had begun to fill some of those wounds. The piece somehow captured both the trauma of the strike and the tree's resilient response to it. "I've been working on this since our first hike," Bear said. "Not because I needed another carving, but because I needed to understand something about my own relationship with the stories I carry." Sarah moved closer to examine the carving, running her fingers along the intricate details that revealed themselves only under close inspection. "It's beautiful, but why did you need to show me this in private?" Bear was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the workbench with the stillness that had become familiar to her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested they were approaching something he rarely shared with anyone. "Because I wanted you to see what I do with the difficult stories before I told you what some of those stories are. I wanted you to understand that I don't carve these pieces to hide from what happened. I carve them to honor it, to make something meaningful from experiences that could have broken me, but didn't." He moved to another section of the workshop, where a series of carvings were displayed on a special shelf. Each piece was clearly autobiographical landscapes that Sarah recognized from their hikes, but rendered with an emotional complexity that spoke of deeper significance. One showed a mountain face scarred by avalanche. Another depicted a forest clearing where something violent had clearly taken place, though the violence itself was suggested rather than explicitly shown. 17 years ago, I was married," Bear sighed, his voice steady but careful. "Had a house in Denver, a job that paid well, a life that looked successful from the outside. My wife Alina was pregnant with our first child, and we were making plans for a future that felt solid and predictable." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand where this story was heading. Bear's tone had the careful control of someone who had told this story before, but never without cost. "The accident happened on a Thursday afternoon in March. Drunk driver ran a red light while Elena was coming home from her doctor's appointment. She was 8 months pregnant." Bear paused, his hands moving to touch one of the carvings, a piece that showed two figures walking together through a landscape that seemed to glow with possibility. "I lost them both that day. Lost everything I thought I understood about how life was supposed to work, about what it meant to build something with another person, about whether any of it mattered if it could be taken away so randomly." Sarah found herself holding her breath, afraid that any movement might interrupt whatever courage was allowing Bear to share this. She'd known there was pain in his history. Nobody chose complete solitude without reason, but the magnitude of this loss was beyond anything she'd imagined. The first 2 years after the accident, I tried to put my life back together the way other people expected me to. Went to grief counseling, tried to return to work, dated women who thought they could help me heal. But everything felt like I was wearing clothes that no longer fit, living in a house that belonged to someone else. Bear picked up another carving, this one showing a single figure walking away from a burning building, carrying nothing but a pack on his back. Eventually, I realized that trying to rebuild my old life was just another way of hiding from what had actually happened to me. So I sold everything, bought this land, and came up here to figure out who I was after losing everything I thought defined me. The workshop around them seemed to take on new significance as Sarah understood that every piece it contained represented not just craftsmanship, but survival evidence of a man who had found a way to transform catastrophic loss into something that honored both what he'd lost and what he'd become in response to that loss. The scars I carry aren't just from avalanches and bear encounters, Bear continued. Some of them are invisible, carved into places that don't show on skin. But I've learned that hiding from those scars, pretending they don't exist or that they don't matter, just makes them fester. The only way I've found to live with them is to acknowledge them, to let them be part of my story without letting them be the whole story. Sarah felt tears starting, though she couldn't say exactly what she was crying for Bear's loss. Her own recognition of how much courage it took to live authentically after devastating trauma, or the sudden understanding of how small her own fears had been in comparison to what some people endured and survived. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Bear turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Because yesterday I got a letter from your mother." The words hit Sarah like cold water. "What?" "She tracked me down somehow. Probably hired someone to find out who you've been spending time with." The letter was comprehensive. She had quite a lot to say about my influence on you, about the kinds of choices you've been making since moving here. Sarah felt the familiar anxiety of her childhood rising, the fear of disappointing people, of being judged, of having her choices scrutinized and found wanting. But underneath that familiar fear was something new, anger. She had no right to contact you. She believes she's protecting you. The letter made it clear that she thinks I'm encouraging you to make decisions that will hurt you in the long run. She's particularly concerned about what she calls your regression into impractical pursuits and dangerous associations. Sarah could hear her mother's voice in those phrases, could imagine the careful way Margaret would have crafted each sentence to maximize its impact. What did the letter say exactly? Bear reached into his jacket and pulled out several pages of expensive stationery covered in her mother's precise handwriting. "She wants me to encourage you to come home. She's prepared to offer financial incentives for my cooperation, and she's made it clear that she has resources to make life difficult for both of us if I don't comply with her wishes." Reading her mother's letter was like being transported back to a world Sarah had almost forgotten, a place where love was conditional on compliance, where concern was expressed through control, where the possibility of failure was considered so catastrophic that it justified any level of interference. Margaret had researched Bear thoroughly, had found ways to make his choice to live outside conventional society sound dangerous and irresponsible. She'd presented Sarah's time in Cedar Ridge as a temporary aberration that needed to be corrected before it caused permanent damage to her future prospects, but it was the final paragraph that revealed the true purpose of the letter. Margaret had discovered that Sarah had been seeing someone, and she'd drawn her own conclusions about what that meant for her daughter's safety and judgment. She'd made it clear that she considered Bear a predator taking advantage of Sarah's emotional vulnerability and naive romanticism about alternative lifestyles. "She thinks we're together," Sarah said, looking up from the letter. "Are we?" Bear asked. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from his cabin's chimney, visible but impossible to grasp. Significant but indefinable, Sarah realized. She'd been avoiding that exact question for weeks, afraid to examine too closely what her feelings for Bear might mean, or where they might lead. The question Bear had asked, "Are we?" followed Sarah down the mountain like an echo that wouldn't fade. She spent the drive back to town staring out the passenger window at landscapes that had become familiar over the months. But everything looked different now, charged with possibilities she'd been too afraid to name. The comfortable friendship they'd built felt suddenly fragile, balanced on the edge of something that could either deepen into something profound or shatter completely if handled wrong. Bear drove in his usual silence, but there was a tension in his posture that suggested he was as unsettled by his own question as she was. Neither of them spoke until he pulled up outside the bookstore, and even then the words felt inadequate for what hung between them. "I need time to think," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure what exactly she needed to think about. Her feelings for Bear had been growing steadily for months, but acknowledging them felt like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee of solid ground below. "Take all the time you need," Bear replied. "But don't let your mother's expectations do the thinking for you." Sarah climbed out of the truck, carrying the weight of both her mother's letter and Bear's revelation about his past. As she watched his taillights disappear up the mountain road, she realized that everything had shifted. The quiet friendship they'd built, the careful boundaries they'd maintained, the unspoken understanding that had allowed them to grow close without examining what that closeness meant, all of it had been blown apart by Margaret's interference. And Bear's honesty about what he'd lost. She spent a sleepless night replaying every conversation they'd had, every moment when their hands had touched while working on carvings, every time she'd caught him looking at her with an expression she'd been too nervous to interpret. By morning, she'd reached a conclusion that surprised her with its clarity. She cared about Bear in ways that went far beyond friendship, and her mother's attempt to control the situation had only made her more certain of her own feelings. But before she could figure out what to do about those feelings, Margaret Chun arrived in Cedar Ridge. Sarah was cataloging new inventory when the rental car pulled up outside the bookstore. Through the window, she watched her mother emerge from a black sedan that looked as out of place on Main Street as a tuxedo at a campfire. Margaret wore her traveling clothes, a wool coat that cost more than most people's rent, leather boots that had never touched actual dirt, and the expression of someone preparing for battle. The bell above the door chimed with unusual violence as Margaret entered the store. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the comfortable chaos of Ruth's domain with the kind of look usually reserved for crime scenes. Her gaze swept over the mismatched furniture, the local artwork on the walls, the smell of wood smoke and coffee that permeated everything. And Sarah could practically see her mother cataloging each detail as evidence of her daughter's poor judgment. "Sarah." Margaret's voice carried the particular chill that had made Sarah's childhood feel like a performance, where the reviews were always harsh. "We need to talk." Ruth, who had been shelving books in the back corner, appeared with the supernatural timing that came from decades of retail experience. "You must be Sarah's mother. I'm Ruth Blackwood. Welcome to Cedar Ridge." Margaret accepted Ruth's handshake with the mechanical politeness she reserved for service workers, her attention already focused on her daughter. "I'd like to speak with Sarah privately." "The store's pretty public," Ruth said mildly. "But there's a cafe next door if you're looking for somewhere quieter." "That won't be necessary." Margaret's tone suggested she considered Ruth's presence irrelevant to the conversation she intended to have. "Sarah, pack your things. We're leaving today." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they carried legal weight. She was 26 years old and could make her own decisions, but because they carried the full force of 26 years of conditioning that had taught her to prioritize her mother's wishes over her own instincts. "I'm not leaving," Sarah said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Margaret's expression shifted to the particular kind of disappointment she wielded like a weapon. "Of course you are. You've had your little adventure, but it's time to come home and fix the damage you've done to your life." What damage? Sarah could feel Ruth's quiet presence behind the counter, supportive but not interfering, and it gave her courage to push back against her mother's certainty. You broke off an engagement to a perfectly suitable man to run away and play house with some hermit who lives in the woods like a refugee from civilization. Margaret's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her usual perfect composure. Do you have any idea how this looks to people who matter? Do you understand what you've thrown away? Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, hot and clean and surprisingly liberating. I threw away a life that was making me miserable. I threw away a future that felt like a prison sentence. And I didn't run away, I moved toward something better. Better? Margaret's laugh was sharp enough to cut. You're working in a bookstore in a town that doesn't exist on most maps, wasting your education and your potential on fantasies about authentic living. And you're involved with a man who has no career, no prospects, and apparently no interest in rejoining normal society. Bear isn't, Sarah started, but Margaret cut her off. Bear? You're calling him Bear? His name is Thomas Kowalski, and I've had him investigated thoroughly. He's a failed architect who abandoned his practice after a personal tragedy, has no stable income, and lives alone in the mountains because he can't handle the normal responsibilities of adult life. The casual cruelty with which Margaret dissected Bear's choices hit Sarah like a slap. Every word was technically accurate, but stripped of context, drained of the courage and intentionality that had actually shaped his decisions. It was exactly the kind of reductive analysis her mother applied to everything that didn't fit her narrow definition of success. You hired investigators? Sarah's voice came out smaller than she'd intended, shock overriding anger. I hired people to find out who my daughter was associating with, yes. And what I discovered was concerning enough that I felt compelled to intervene before you make any more decisions you'll regret for the rest of your life. Ruth stepped forward then, her usually gentle demeanor replaced by something considerably more formidable. Ma'am, I think you should know that your daughter is one of the most capable and thoughtful young women I've had the pleasure of working with. She's built a life here that brings her genuine happiness, and she's earned the respect and affection of this entire community. Margaret turned her attention to Ruth with the kind of look that had intimidated school principals and social workers throughout Sarah's childhood. I'm sure she's been very helpful to you, but you have to understand that Sarah comes from a different world than this. She has opportunities and responsibilities that require her to make more strategic choices about her future. The only strategic choice I've made in the last year was leaving Boston, Sarah said, finding her voice again. Everything else, the engagement, the job, the apartment that looked like a furniture showroom, those were choices you made for me. Choices I made to protect you from exactly this kind of impulsive decision-making. Margaret's composure was cracking more visibly now, revealing the genuine fear underneath her controlling behavior. You've always been too trusting, too willing to believe that following your feelings will lead to happiness. But feelings change, Sarah. Security doesn't. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Bear's truck pulling up outside. Through the window, Sarah could see him climbing out, moving with his usual careful economy, but with something purposeful in his posture that suggested he knew exactly what he was walking into. Perfect, Margaret said, spotting him through the glass. Now I can address this situation directly. Bear entered the store with the same quiet presence he brought to everything, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he took in the scene. Margaret's aggressive posture, Sarah's obvious distress, Ruth's protective stance behind the counter. Mrs. Chun, he said, acknowledging Margaret with a nod that was polite but not deferential. I got your letter. Then you understand why I'm here. Margaret studied Bear with the calculating gaze she usually reserved for business negotiations. I'm prepared to make this worth your while if you help me convince Sarah to return home where she belongs. Bear was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. suddenly terrified that her mother's offer might appeal to him in ways she hadn't considered. But when he spoke, his voice carried the same steady certainty that had anchored her through months of learning to trust herself. "Sarah belongs wherever she chooses to be," he said. "And she's capable of making that choice without either of us telling her what's best for her." Margaret's expression hardened. "You're not being naive about this situation, are you, Mr. Kowalski?" A woman from Sarah's background, with her education and family connections, she's not going to be content with this lifestyle permanently. You're setting yourself up for disappointment, and you're encouraging her to make decisions that will limit her future options. "What lifestyle?" Bear asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Working at a job she enjoys? Living in a community where she's valued? Learning skills that bring her satisfaction?" Seems like those are exactly the kinds of options most people spend their lives trying to create. "I'm talking about practical considerations," Margaret said, her voice rising. "Financial security, career advancement, social connections that matter. I'm talking about building a life that will sustain her when the novelty of all this authenticity wears off." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement at how differently Bear and her mother perceived the same set of facts. To Margaret, Sarah's life in Cedar Ridge was a temporary rebellion that would inevitably collapse under the weight of real-world pressures. To Bear, it was evidence of courage and good judgment, proof that Sarah was capable of creating a life aligned with her actual values rather than other people's expectations. "The life you're describing," Bear said carefully, "is that what Sarah wants or what you want for her?" It was a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of everything. Sarah realized that in all the years of planning and guidance and careful decision-making, her mother had never actually asked what she wanted. Margaret had simply assumed that what she wanted for Sarah was the same as what Sarah wanted for herself. "I want her to be happy," Margaret said, but her voice carried less conviction than before. "Then maybe you should ask her what makes her happy," Bear replied. All three adults turned to look at Sarah, who suddenly found herself at the center of a conversation that felt like it would determine the direction of her entire future. The old Sarah would have tried to find some compromise that avoided disappointing anyone, would have looked for ways to meet both her mother's expectations and her own desires, without fully committing to either, but the woman she'd become over. The past months had learned something important about the cost of trying to live multiple lives simultaneously. She'd learned that authenticity required choosing, even when choosing meant accepting that not everyone would approve of her choices. "I'm happy here," she said, and as the words left her mouth, she realized how true they were. "Happier than I've ever been. I wake up looking forward to the day ahead instead of counting hours until I can escape into sleep. I'm learning things that interest me, building relationships with people who value me for who I am rather than who they think I should become." Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disappointment, and finally something that might have been recognition. "You're serious about this?" "Completely serious." Sarah took a step closer to Bear, not quite touching him, but close enough that her choice was unmistakable. "I'm not running away from anything anymore, Mom. I'm running toward something. And what I'm running toward includes Bear." The silence that followed felt weighted with possibilities. Margaret looked between Sarah and Bear, clearly recalculating whatever strategy she'd arrived with. Ruth continued shelving books as if family dramas played out in her store every day. Bear stood perfectly still, waiting to see what Sarah would choose without trying to influence her decision. "If this is what you really want," Margaret said finally, "then I suppose I'll have to learn to accept it. But I want you to know that you're making this much harder than it needs to be." "Hard isn't the same as wrong," Sarah replied, unconsciously, echoing something Bear had told her months earlier about mountain climbing. Margaret gathered her coat and purse with movements that suggested she was retreating to regroup rather than surrendering entirely. "I'll be staying at the hotel in town tonight." We can discuss the practical aspects of your decision tomorrow." After she left, the store felt suddenly empty despite having the same number of people in it. Sarah realized she was shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline that came with finally speaking truths she'd been carrying for months. "That was brave," Ruth said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "That was terrifying," Sarah corrected. Bear moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool air of the store. "Are you okay?" Sarah looked up at him, taking in the concern in his dark eyes, the careful way he held himself as if ready to provide comfort or distance depending on what she needed. "Ask me again." "What?" "The question you asked yesterday. Ask me again." Bear's expression shifted to something Sarah had never seen before, hope mixed with vulnerability, possibility tempered by caution. "Are we together?" This time Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes, we are." The morning after Sarah's declaration brought an unusual warmth to the mountain air. One of those February days when winter loosened its grip, just enough to remind everyone that spring existed somewhere beneath the snow. Sarah woke in her small apartment above the bookstore, feeling like she'd shed an old skin overnight. The conversation with her mother had been brutal, but it had also been necessary, a cauterizing flame that had burned away years of accumulated doubt about her own judgment. Bear arrived at the store just as Ruth was opening, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe next door and wearing an expression that somehow managed to be both hopeful and cautious. The 3 of them had developed a comfortable morning routine over the winter months, but today felt different. Everything felt different now that Sarah had spoken her truth aloud. "How did you sleep?" Bear asked, handing her one of the coffee cups. "Like someone who finally stopped lying to herself," Sarah replied, accepting the warmth of both the coffee and the gesture. "It's remarkably restful." Ruth looked between them with the satisfaction of someone who had been watching a slow dance finally reach its conclusion. "About time you two figured that out. I was starting to think I'd have to lock you in the storage room together." The morning passed quietly, with customers trickling in for books and conversation while Sarah and Bear worked together on inventory. There was a new ease between them now that the uncertainty had been resolved, but also a heightened awareness of each other's presence that made simple tasks feel charged with significance. When their hands brushed reaching for the same book, when he stood close enough that she could smell the pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes, when she caught him watching her with an expression she no longer had to pretend not to understand, everything felt simultaneously familiar and thrillingly new. At noon, Margaret appeared again, this time dressed in clothes that suggested she'd made an effort to blend in with the local environment. Her expensive boots had been replaced with hiking shoes, her wool coat with a down jacket that still had store tags attached. The effect was less convincing than it was touching, a woman trying to understand a world that her daughter had chosen over everything familiar. "I was hoping we could talk again," Margaret said, addressing both Sarah and Bear. "Perhaps somewhere more private this time." Bear glanced at Sarah, reading her expression with the fluency that came from months of learning to communicate without words. "There's a trail about 10 minutes from here that leads to a overlook, if you don't mind a short hike." Margaret's hesitation was visible, but she nodded. "I think I can manage that." The trail Bear had chosen was one of the easier ones in the area, but it still required attention to footing and a certain comfort with uneven terrain. Sarah watched her mother navigate the path with determination that bordered on stubbornness, clearly uncomfortable but refusing to admit it. Every few minutes, Margaret would pause to catch her breath or adjust her new jacket, and Sarah found herself seeing her mother differently, not as the perfectly controlled force that had dominated her childhood, but as a woman in her 60s, trying to understand choices that challenged everything she'd believed about how life should work. The overlook, when they reached it, offered a view that stretched across valleys and peaks to distant horizons that seemed to go on forever. Margaret stood at the edge of the rocky outcrop, breathing hard from the climb but clearly affected by the vast beauty spread before them. "It's magnificent," she said, and for the first time since arriving, her voice carried no calculation, no hidden agenda, just honest response to something that exceeded her expectations. "This is what Sarah sees every day now," Bear said quietly. "This is the world she's chosen to live in." Margaret was silent for several minutes, and Sarah found herself studying her mother's profile as she processed both the physical landscape and its metaphorical implications. Finally, Margaret turned away from the view to face them both. "I owe you an apology," she said, addressing Bear directly. "Not for being concerned about my daughter's welfare, but for the way I expressed that concern. I made assumptions about your character and motivations that weren't fair or accurate." Bear accepted this with a nod that acknowledged the apology without making it easier for her. "You were protecting someone you love. I understand that impulse. But protection can become control without you realizing it," Margaret continued, now looking at Sarah. "And control can become its own kind of harm, even when it comes from love." Sarah felt tears starting, not from sadness but from the unexpected relief of hearing her mother acknowledge something she'd never been able to articulate herself. "I know you love me, Mom, but the way you showed that love often felt like you didn't trust me to make good decisions for myself, because I was terrified you'd make the same mistakes I did," Margaret said, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "I married your father because he was safe, because he represented security and status and all the things I'd been taught to value. But I was never happy with him, Sarah. Not really. I spent 30 years in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty inside. And I was so afraid you'd choose passion over security and end up hurt that I tried to steer you toward the same safe emptiness that I'd settled for." The admission hung in the mountain air like something fragile and precious. Sarah had never heard her mother speak about her marriage with anything approaching honesty, had never suspected that the perfect life she'd been raised to emulate was built on such profound compromise. "But you seemed so certain about everything," Sarah said. "So sure that your way was the right way." "Because uncertainty is terrifying when you're responsible for someone else's future," Margaret replied. "It's easier to be wrong with conviction than right with doubt. But watching you these past few months, seeing how you've grown and changed since leaving Boston, I'm starting to think that maybe being wrong with conviction isn't actually easier. Maybe it's just more familiar." Bear had remained quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke with the careful tone of someone offering a different perspective without claiming superior wisdom. "Safety isn't always found in the things that look safe from the outside. Sometimes the safest choice is the one that honors who you actually are instead of who you think you should be." Margaret studied Bear's face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You really love her." "I do," Bear said simply. "But more than that, I respect her. I trust her judgment and her strength, and her ability to create a life worth living. That's not something I could fake or manufacture for financial gain." "And you make her happy?" "She makes herself happy," Bear corrected. "I just try not to interfere with that process." Margaret looked between them for a long moment, and Sarah could practically see her reassessing everything she believed about their relationship. The predatory hermit of her imagination was being replaced by a man who spoke about her daughter with genuine respect and affection, who understood that love meant supporting someone's growth rather than limiting their choices. "I need to ask you something," Margaret said, turning to Sarah, "and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you want children?" The question caught Sarah off guard, though she realized it shouldn't have. Margaret's concern about biological clocks and optimal timing for family planning had been a constant undercurrent in all their conversations about Sarah's future. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "Maybe, someday, but not because it's what I'm supposed to want or because there's some timeline I need to follow. If I have children, I want it to be because Bear and I decide together that we want to build a family, Not because I'm running out of time to check that box. And you? Margaret asked Bear. Bear was quiet for a moment, and Sarah found herself genuinely curious about his answer. They'd never discussed children directly, though she'd wondered how his loss might affect his feelings about the possibility of becoming a father again. I lost a child once, Bear said finally. For a long time, I thought that meant I could never risk loving another child, could never open myself to that kind of loss again. But being with Sarah is teaching me that avoiding love, because you might lose it, is just another way of losing it anyway. If we decide we want children, I'll be grateful for the chance to love them and terrified of losing them, and I'll try to let both of those feelings make me a better father. His honesty was like a gift, Sarah realized, not just to her mother, but to her. He'd revealed something deeply personal, not to win Margaret's approval, but because the question deserved a truthful answer. It was exactly the kind of response that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. Margaret was crying now, tears that she didn't try to hide or apologize for. I've been so afraid of you making mistakes that I forgot to trust that you might actually know what you're doing. I don't know what I'm doing, Sarah said. Not entirely. But I know what feels right, and I know what makes me happy, and I know that trying to build a life based on other people's definitions of success was slowly killing something essential in me. Show me, Margaret said suddenly. What? Show me? What your life looks like here. Really looks like. Not just the pretty parts or the parts you think will reassure me. Show me everything. Sarah exchanged a glance with Bear, who nodded slightly. Okay, but that means coming up to the cabin, seeing how we actually spend our time together. It means understanding that this isn't some fantasy we're playing at. It's real life, with all the challenges and complexities that entails. I'm ready for that, Margaret said, though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. The hike back to town passed in contemplative silence, each of them processing the conversation in their own way. Sarah found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, hope that her relationship with her mother might evolve into something based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval. It wouldn't be easy patterns established. Over decades didn't change overnight, but for the first time, it felt possible. That evening, the three of them drove up to Bear's cabin as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. Margaret was quiet during the ride, her city-trained reflexes clearly struggling with the steep, winding road that seemed to drop off into nothing on one side. But when they finally reached the clearing and she saw the cabin in the golden light of mountain evening, Sarah heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. It's beautiful, Margaret said, and this time there was no surprise in her voice, only recognition. Bear gave them a tour of the cabin, with the same careful attention to detail he brought to everything else. He showed Margaret the solar panels and backup generator that provided power, the wood stove that heated the space efficiently, the workshop where he created the furniture and carvings that supplemented his modest income. He explained the systems he'd developed for water collection and waste management, the garden where he grew vegetables during the short mountain summer, the root cellar where he stored food for the long winters. What emerged from this tour was a picture not of someone escaping from responsibility, but of someone who had chosen to take responsibility for every aspect of his existence. Bear's life required skills and knowledge that most people had never developed, demanded a level of self-sufficiency that few could achieve. It was the opposite of the aimless dropout Margaret had imagined. This must have taken years to build, Margaret said, running her hand along the smooth surface of a dining table Bear had crafted from a single piece of pine. 8 years to get it where I wanted it, Bear confirmed. And it's still evolving. Last summer I added the workshop expansion. And I'm planning to build a greenhouse this spring. For Sarah? Bear and Sarah looked at each other, and Sarah realized this was the first time they'd talked about the future beyond the immediate present. The assumption that she would be part of his long-term plans, felt both thrilling and terrifying. "For us," Bear said simply. "If that's what Sarah wants." Margaret spent the evening watching them together, the easy way they moved around each other in the small space, how they communicated with glances and touches, the obvious comfort they found in each other's presence. As the fire burned down, and the conversation grew quieter, Sarah could see her mother beginning to understand that this wasn't a temporary infatuation or a rebellious phase. It was a life they were building together, deliberately and with full awareness of what they were choosing. When it came time to drive Margaret back to her hotel, she lingered in the doorway of the cabin as if reluctant to leave this glimpse into her daughter's chosen world. "I'm still scared for you," she said to Sarah. "But I'm starting to think I was scared of the wrong things." "What do you mean?" "I was afraid you'd choose a life that wouldn't provide security or status or conventional success. But I should have been afraid that you'd choose a life that wouldn't provide joy." And this, she gestured to encompass the cabin, the mountains, the obvious contentment Sarah had found here. "This clearly provides joy." As they drove down the mountain road, Margaret was quiet until they reached the outskirts of town. Then she spoke into the darkness of the truck cab. "I want to understand this better. Your life here, your relationship with Bear. What makes you happy? Would you be willing to teach me?" Sarah felt something tight in her chest finally relax. "I'd love that, Mom. I really would." Spring arrived in the mountains like a secret slowly being revealed. Snow melted in patches, exposing brown earth that seemed to exhale after months of winter sleep. Streams that had been silent under ice began to sing again, and the air carried scents that spoke of renewal and possibility. Margaret had extended her stay in Cedar Ridge indefinitely, renting a small cabin on the edge of town and settling into the rhythm of mountain life with a determination that surprised everyone, including herself. The woman who had arrived in February, wearing designer clothes and carrying assumptions about her daughter's poor judgment, had transformed into someone Sarah barely recognized. Margaret rose early each morning to walk the trails around town, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated weather changes and seasonal shifts. She spent afternoons in the bookstore, helping Ruth with inventory and discovering that she had a talent for recommending books to customers based on conversations rather than algorithms. In the evenings, she often joined Sarah and Bear at the cabin, where she was slowly learning to carve wood under Bear's patient instruction. "I can't believe how much my hands hurt," Margaret said one April evening, flexing fingers that were developing the calluses that came from working with tools. She was attempting to carve a simple bowl from a piece of pine, and her perfectionist tendencies were battling against the wood's natural inclinations in ways that provided both frustration and unexpected insight. "It's because you're trying to force the wood to do what you want instead of learning what it wants to do," Bear observed, watching her struggle with a particularly stubborn section. "The grain is telling you to go left, but you keep trying to go right." Margaret paused in her work to study the piece more carefully. Over the past 2 months, she'd begun to understand that Bear's woodworking lessons were actually lessons about much larger concepts: patience, attention, the art of working with natural forces rather than against them. "You're talking about more than carving, aren't you?" "I'm always talking about more than carving," Bear replied with the hint of a smile. Sarah figured that out months ago. Sarah looked up from her own project, a complex relief carving that depicted the changing seasons in the mountains, and caught her mother studying her with an expression she'd never seen before. It wasn't the evaluative gaze that had dominated her childhood, constantly measuring her against external standards. Instead, it was simple curiosity, genuine interest in understanding who Sarah had become when freed from the constraints of other people's expectations. "What?" Sarah asked. "I'm trying to remember if I ever saw you this relaxed when you were growing up," Margaret said. "I don't think I did. I think you were always performing, even at home. Especially at home." The observation hit Sarah with unexpected force. She'd known that her childhood had been shaped by the need to meet her mother's standards, but she'd never considered how exhausting it must have been to never feel safe enough to simply exist without evaluation. I was afraid of disappointing you, Sarah said honestly. Everything felt like a test I might fail. Margaret set down her carving tools and was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was still processing discoveries about herself and her role in shaping her daughter's early experience. I think I was afraid of being disappointed. Not by you, but by life in general. I'd made so many compromises, settled for so much less than what I'd dreamed of when I was young, that I convinced myself the problem was that I'd been too idealistic. So I tried to protect you from idealism, from hoping for too much, from taking risks that might not pay off. Bear continued working on his own pisa, intricate carving of intertwined mountain laurel that would serve as a wedding gift for a couple in town. But Sarah could tell he was listening carefully to the conversation. Over the months, he'd become skilled at providing presence without interference, offering the gift of witnessing without judgment. But what I actually protected you from, Margaret continued, was the possibility of discovering what you were truly capable of. I was so focused on preventing failure that I forgot to encourage success that looked different from what I'd imagined. Sarah felt tears starting, not from sadness but from the profound relief of being truly seen by her mother for the first time in her adult life. I spent so many years thinking I was disappointing you by not being ambitious enough, not wanting the things you wanted for me. You were never disappointing me, Margaret said firmly. You were disappointing the version of you that I'd created in my head, the one who would validate all my choices by making the same ones, but that version was never real. She was just my fear dressed up as love. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a truck pulling into the clearing outside the cabin. Through the window, they could see Ruth climbing out, followed by Jim Harrison from the hardware store and Elena Rodriguez, who owned the cafe. It was unusual for multiple people to visit Bear's cabin simultaneously, most of the town respected his preference for smaller gatherings, but the expressions on their faces suggested this wasn't a social call. Bear went to the door before they could knock, greeting his unexpected visitors with the careful attention he gave to anything that disrupted established patterns. Everything all right? Ruth stepped forward, clearly designated as the spokesperson for the group. We need to talk to you about something. All of you, actually. Is Margaret here? I'm here, Margaret called from inside the cabin. What's wrong? The group settled around Bear's small living area, and Sarah noticed the careful way they arranged themselves, not quite a circle, but positioned so everyone could see everyone else. It was the formation of people preparing to discuss something significant. The town council met yesterday, Jim began, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something more serious. We've been approached by a development company from Denver. They want to buy most of the land around Cedar Ridge and turn it into a resort destination. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd seen what happened to small mountain towns when outside developers discovered them, the way they lost their character and community as property values skyrocketed and longtime residents were priced out. What kind of resort? Bear asked, though his tone suggested he could guess. The luxury kind, Elena said bitterly. Ski slopes, golf course, spa facilities, vacation homes starting at $3 million. They're calling it an authentic mountain experience for discerning travelers. How much of the town? Margaret asked, and Sarah was surprised by the concern in her mother's voice. 80% of the privately owned land, Ruth replied, including the building where the bookstore is located, Jim's hardware store, Elena's cafe. They've made offers that are substantial, enough that some people are already talking about selling. Sarah understood immediately why they'd come to Bear's cabin for this conversation. As someone who owned significant acreage and had deep ties to the community, his response to the development proposal would carry weight with others who were trying to decide what to do. "What are they offering for your land?" Sarah asked. Bear was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the careful control he used when discussing things that mattered deeply to him. "Enough to set me up for life anywhere. Else I wanted to live, more than enough." "But?" Margaret prompted, recognizing the undertone that suggested significant reservations. "But this isn't about money for me. This land, this community, it's where I rebuilt my life after losing everything that mattered to me. It's where I learned to be whole again. I can't put a price on that." Ruth leaned forward, her expression intense. "The thing is, if enough people sell, the character of this place changes completely. Even those of us who stay will be living in a different town, surrounded by people who see the mountains as entertainment rather than home." Sarah found herself thinking about the lightning-scarred tree she'd encountered on her first hike with Bear, how he'd explained that the tree would spend years deciding whether to adapt or die. The metaphor felt suddenly relevant to their current situation. "What happens if nobody sells?" she asked. "They move on to the next town," Jim replied. "There are plenty of mountain communities that would welcome this kind of investment. We're not their only option, but we are their preferred option," Elena added. "The development company has done their research. Cedar Ridge has the right combination of scenic beauty, reasonable access to Denver, and current affordability that makes it ideal for their target market." Margaret had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention she usually reserved for business negotiations. Now she spoke with the analytical tone that Sarah remembered from her mother's professional life. "What's the timeline for decisions?" "They want answers by the end of May," Ruth said, "which gives everyone about 6 weeks to decide whether to sell or hold. And they've made it clear that the offer is contingent on getting enough properties to make the development viable. If they can't get what they need, they withdraw offers." Sarah realized that her mother was viewing this situation through the lens of her business experience, looking for leverage points and strategic considerations that others might miss. "You think there's a way to negotiate?" "I think there's always a way to negotiate," Margaret replied. "But first we need to understand what we're actually negotiating for. Is the goal to stop the development entirely, or to find a way to control how it happens?" Bear stood and moved to the window, looking out over the clearing toward the peaks that rose beyond. Sarah could see him processing the implications of what they'd just learned, weighing his attachment to this place against the reality of forces beyond his control. "For me," he said finally, "the goal is to preserve what makes this place special. The community, the relationship with the land, the sense that people matter more than profit. If development is inevitable, then maybe we need to find a way to do it on our terms instead of theirs." "You mean counter-propose?" Ruth asked. "I mean take control of our own future instead of letting someone else control it for us," Bear replied. "What if we approach this differently? What if instead of just reacting to their offer, we created our own vision for what Cedar Ridge could become?" Margaret was nodding slowly, and Sarah could practically see her mother's strategic mind engaging with the problem. "You're talking about community-controlled development, maintaining local ownership while managing growth in ways that preserve the town's character. Is that possible?" Elena asked. "It's complicated," Margaret admitted, "but it's not impossible. There are models for this kind of thing: conservation easements, community land trusts, cooperative ownership structures. It would require everyone working together, and it would mean accepting some change while trying to control the nature of that change." Sarah found herself amazed by this side of her mother, the competent professional who could analyze complex problems and identify potential solutions. It was a reminder that Margaret's controlling tendencies, however damaging they'd been in personal relationships, came from genuine skills that could be valuable in the right context. "Would you be willing to help us explore those options?" Ruth asked. Margaret looked around the cabin, at Bear's handmade furniture, at Sarah's wood carvings scattered on the table, at the view of peaks and forest that stretched beyond the windows. Sarah could see her making a decision that went beyond simple business advice. "Yes," Margaret said firmly, "but I want to be clear about something. I'm not just offering to help because you asked. I'm offering because this place has become important to me too. These past 2 months have been the most authentic I've felt in years, and I'm not ready to lose that." The evening that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. A planning session that felt more like a gathering of family than a business meeting. They spread maps across Bear's dining table, sketched possible scenarios on scraps of paper, and talked through options with the kind of passionate engagement that came from people fighting for something they loved. As the night wore on and specific plans began to take shape, Sarah realized she was witnessing something remarkable. Her mother, who had spent decades trying to control outcomes through careful planning and risk avoidance, was now volunteering to take on a complex and uncertain fight on behalf of a community she'd known for only 2 months. Bear, who had chosen solitude after losing everything once before, was opening himself to the vulnerability that came with caring deeply about something that could be taken away. And she herself was discovering that the happiness she'd found in Cedar Ridge was worth fighting to preserve, even if fighting meant risking the comfortable life she'd built. "You know," Margaret said as they finally began cleaning up their scattered papers and empty coffee cups, "6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in a cabin in the mountains, planning to take on a development company, I'd have had them checked for head injuries. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be planning strategy with my mother and looking forward to it, I'd have said the same thing," Sarah replied. Bear collected the maps they'd been working with, folding them carefully and setting them aside for the next day's work. "Funny how the things we think are impossible become inevitable once we stop being afraid of them." As Ruth, Jim, and Alina prepared to leave, there was an energy in the cabin that hadn't been there before, the particular combination of excitement and determination that came from people who had found a cause worth their effort. Sarah walked them to their vehicles, breathing mountain air that somehow tasted different now that she understood how much was at stake. "Thank you," Ruth said before climbing into her truck, "for everything, but especially for bringing someone like your mother into our community. We're going to need her skills." After the others had gone, Sarah, Bear, and Margaret sat around the fire that Bear had built in the cabin's wood stove. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the only sounds were the crackling of burning pine and the distant call of an owl somewhere in the forest. "I have a confession to make," Margaret said, breaking the comfortable silence. "When I first came here, I thought I was going to rescue Sarah from a life that was beneath her potential. But what I've actually discovered is a life that's worthy of her potential in ways I never imagined." Sarah curled closer to Bear on the small couch they shared, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the equally important presence of her mother's evolving understanding. "Does this mean you're planning to stay?" Margaret smiled, the first completely unguarded smile Sarah had seen from her mother in years. "I think it means I'm planning to fight for the right to stay. All of us." The town hall meeting that Margaret organized for the 3rd week of May drew a crowd that spilled beyond the small community center's capacity. Folding chairs had been arranged in tight rows, but people still stood along the walls and clustered near the entrance, creating an atmosphere of barely contained energy. Sarah arrived early with Bear and Margaret, watching as neighbors she'd come to know over the past year filed in with expressions that ranged from curious to determined to openly worried. Margaret had spent the previous 3 weeks working with an intensity that reminded Sarah of her mother's corporate days, but channeled towards something entirely different. Instead of quarterly profit reports, she was analyzing conservation easement structures. Rather than board presentations, she was coordinating with environmental lawyers and community development specialists. The dining table at her rented cabin had become a command center covered with legal documents, financial projections, and maps marked with different colored pens to indicate various strategic scenarios. "The key thing to remember," Margaret said, addressing the packed room with the confidence that came from thorough preparation, "is that we have more power in this situation than the developers want us to believe. They need a critical mass of properties to make their project viable. That gives us leverage, but only if we coordinate our response." Tom Bradley, who owned the gas station and had been openly considering the developer's offer, raised his hand. "With respect, Mrs. Chun, some of us have been struggling to keep our businesses profitable for years. This offer represents financial security we might never see again." Margaret nodded, acknowledging his concern without dismissing it. "I understand that completely, Tom, and I want to be clear that I'm not here to tell anyone what they should do with their property. What I'm here to do is make sure everyone has complete information about all their options before making a decision that can't be undone." She moved to an easel where she'd prepared a series of charts showing different financial scenarios. "The developers are offering what seems like a lot of money up front, but there are other ways to capture value from development that don't require selling your land entirely." Over the next hour, Margaret walked the room through concepts that most of the residents had never encountered. Community land trusts that could preserve local ownership while allowing development, profit-sharing arrangements that would give current landowners ongoing income from resort operations, conservation easements that could provide immediate cash while maintaining community control over future land use. "What you're describing sounds complicated," said Martha Stevens, who ran the town's small grocery store. "How do we know these alternatives would actually work?" "Because they've worked in other places facing similar pressures," Margaret replied, clicking to a slide showing case studies from mountain communities across Colorado. Crested Butte used a combination of these strategies to maintain community character while accommodating growth. Telluride wished they had. Bear, who had been quiet through most of the presentation, stood to address the room. "I know some of you are wondering why I'm involved in this at all. I chose to live alone up here partly to avoid exactly these kinds of community decisions. But over the past year, I've been reminded that even hermits don't exist in isolation. This place, this community, it's part of who I've become. And I've learned that sometimes protecting what you value requires engaging with threats rather than retreating from them." His words carried particular weight because everyone knew Bear's history, understood that his choice to participate in community decisions represented a significant shift from his usual approach to problems. Sarah felt pride watching him speak, seeing how he'd found a way to honor both his need for solitude and his growing investment in the people around him. Elena Rodriguez stood next, her voice carrying the passion that made her cafe a gathering place for locals. "I want to know what happens to our children if we sell out to these developers. My daughter Sophia is 8 years old. She knows every trail around here, helps me serve coffee to customers who've become like family. If this place becomes a playground for wealthy tourists, where does she belong?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah could see it resonating with other parents in the room. This wasn't just about property values or business opportunities. It was about whether the next generation would inherit a community or a commodity. Margaret had prepared for this concern as well. "One of the things we can negotiate for, if we choose to engage with controlled development rather than fighting it entirely, is guaranteed affordable housing for local families. Requirements that a certain percentage of new jobs go to current residents. Investment in schools and infrastructure that benefits the existing community." "And if the developers refuse those conditions?" asked Jim Harrison. "Then we refuse their offer," Margaret said simply. "But we make that decision together, based on complete information, rather than individually based on fear or financial pressure." Meeting continued for another hour, with Margaret fielding questions about everything from property tax implications to environmental impact assessments. Sarah found herself amazed by her mother's command of details she'd mastered in just a few weeks. Her ability to translate complex concepts into language that made sense to people whose expertise lay in other areas. But more than Margaret's competence, what struck Sarah was her genuine investment in the outcome. This wasn't a consulting project or a favor to her daughter. It was a fight for something Margaret had come to value personally. Watching her mother defend Cedar Ridge with the same intensity she'd once brought to protecting Sarah's future made Sarah understand something important about where they'd both come from and where they were going. After the meeting ended and the community center had emptied, Sarah, Bear, and Margaret walked slowly back toward town in the gathering dusk. The evening air carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of the stream that ran behind Main Street, reminders of what was at stake in ways that went beyond economics or property rights. "That went well," Margaret said, though her voice carried the exhaustion that came from high-stakes public speaking. "People are asking good questions, thinking through the implications. That's what we needed." "You were impressive up there," Bear told her. "I've seen plenty of people try to explain complex ideas to groups that aren't familiar with the concepts. Most of them fail because they can't let go of jargon or because they don't really understand their audience. You did both." Margaret looked, pleased by the compliment, but also thoughtful. "I spent so many years using my skills to help corporations maximize profit at the expense of everything else. It feels good to use those same skills to help people protect what they value instead of being forced to sell it." They paused at the intersection where their paths would diverge. Margaret to her rental cabin, Sarah and Bear to the truck that would take them up the mountain. The streetlights had come on, casting pools of warm light that made the small town look like something from a postcard, though Sarah knew the reality was more complex than any tourist photograph could capture. "There's something I need to tell you both," Margaret said, her tone suggesting she'd been working up to this moment. "I've made a decision about my own future that I haven't shared yet." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the old fear that her mother was about to announce some plan that would disrupt the life Sarah had built. "What kind of decision?" "I've put my house in Boston on the market. I'm going to make Cedar Ridge my permanent home." The words hit Sarah with surprising force, not anxiety this time, but joy mixed with something that might have been relief. She'd grown to love having her mother nearby, had come to value the relationship they were building based on mutual respect rather than old patterns of control and compliance. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked. "This is a big change from everything you're used to." Margaret smiled, and Sarah recognized something new in her expression, the particular contentment that came from making decisions based on what felt right rather than what looked appropriate. "I'm more sure than I've been about anything in years. I've spent the last 2 months learning who I am when I'm not trying to live up to other people's expectations or manage other people's choices. Turns out I like that person quite a lot." Bear extended his hand to Margaret, a gesture that had become their version of a hug, respect and affection, expressed through contact that honored both people's boundaries. "Welcome home, Margaret." As they walked their separate ways, Sarah found herself thinking about the different kinds of courage required to build a life worth living. There was the courage to leave what wasn't working, which she'd needed to escape Boston. There was the courage to trust someone with your heart, which had brought her and Bear together. And there was the courage to fight for what you'd built, which was what the community was facing now. But perhaps the most difficult courage was the kind her mother had shown, the willingness to admit that your entire understanding of how life should work might be wrong, and then to change course even when that meant abandoning decades of investment in a particular identity. That night, lying in Bear's arms in the cabin that had become home, Sarah listened to the sounds of the mountain settling into sleep around them. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other across valleys carved by ancient glaciers. Closer, the cabin's wood frame adjusted to the cool night air with small creaks and sighs. And underneath it all, the profound silence that had First frightened her, and now felt like peace. "Do you think we'll win?" she asked Bear, though she wasn't entirely sure what winning would look like. "I think we'll figure out how to keep what matters most," Bear replied, his voice drowsy but certain. "That's different from winning, but it might be better." Sarah thought about that distinction as sleep gradually claimed her. The difference between defeating an opponent and protecting what you loved. Between winning and simply refusing to lose the things that made life worth living. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more negotiations, more difficult decisions about balancing change with preservation. But tonight, surrounded by the mountains that had taught her to value scars as stories rather than shame, held by the man who had shown her that revealing your authentic self was the bravest thing you could do, she felt ready for whatever came next. 1 year later, Sarah stood at the edge of the same overlook where her mother had first begun to understand the world her daughter had chosen. But everything was different now: the view, the season, and most importantly, the stories that had brought them to this moment. The development company had withdrawn their offer in August, frustrated by the community's coordinated response and unwilling to accept the conditions that Margaret had negotiated on behalf of the residents. Instead of the luxury resort that would have transformed Cedar Ridge beyond recognition, the town had implemented its own vision for controlled growth, a conservation land trust that protected the surrounding wilderness, while allowing for modest, community-designed development that served local needs rather than tourist fantasies. Margaret's house sat below them in the valley, a modest cabin she'd built on land purchased from a rancher ready to retire. From this distance, it looked like it had always been part of the landscape, though Sarah knew every detail of its construction had been debated and refined through months of work with Bear and a local contractor who specialized in sustainable building techniques. "Hard to believe it's only been 18 months since I first drove up that road," Sarah said, pointing toward the winding track that led from town to Bear's cabin, their cabin now, though they'd maintained his smaller guest cabin as workspace. And occasional retreat when solitude called. Bear followed her gaze, then turned his attention back to the piece of wood he was carving. Even on this anniversary hike, he couldn't resist bringing a project along, though Sarah had learned that the carving was as much meditation as work for him. This particular piece was a wedding gift, their own wedding, planned for the following month in the clearing outside their cabin, with Margaret officiating after obtaining her minister's license online specifically for the occasion. 18 months, but it feels like a whole lifetime, Bear said, pausing to examine the emerging form of two figures walking together through a landscape that could have been anywhere in these mountains. Everything that mattered changed in that time. Sarah settled beside him on the sun-warmed rock, close enough to feel his presence without interfering with his work. Below them, the town went about its afternoon business, Ruth arranging a window display at the bookstore, Elena serving coffee to customers who lingered on the cafe's new outdoor deck, children playing in the small park that the community had created where a developer's planned golf course would have gone. "I've been thinking about scars lately," Sarah said, unconsciously running her thumb along the newest mark on her palma, thin line earned while learning to use the draw knife that had become her favorite tool for furniture making. "How they're not really about what hurt you, but about what you survived and what you learned in the process." Bear smiled, recognizing the evolution of ideas they'd been exploring together since their first hike. "And what have you learned from yours?" Sarah considered the question while studying her hands, which now bore the evidence of a year spent learning new skills and building a life with her own hands rather than inheriting one designed by others. Each mark had a story to burn from. Her first attempt at blacksmithing, the network of small cuts from countless hours spent carving, the calluses that spoke of work that felt meaningful rather than merely productive. "That hiding them was the most dangerous thing I could do," she said finally. "When you hide your scars, you hide your stories. And when you hide your stories, you end up living someone else's life instead of your own." From their vantage point, they could see Margaret working in her garden, planting vegetables that would feed her through the coming winter. She'd thrown herself into mountain life with the same intensity she'd once brought to corporate advancement, but with a joy that had been missing from her previous achievements. Her hands, once manicured to perfection, now bore the honest marks of someone who grew her own food, built her own furniture, and had learned that competence was more satisfying than appearance. "Your mother's quite a success story herself," Bear observed, watching Margaret's efficient movements among the raised beds she'd constructed with Jim Harrison's help. "Though I don't think she'd recognize herself from 2 years ago." Sarah laughed, remembering the woman who had arrived in Cedar Ridge wearing designer clothes and carrying certainty about how life should be lived. "She told me last week that she's never been happier, but she's also never been more uncertain about the future. She said uncertainty used to terrify her, but now it feels like freedom." They sat in comfortable silence, watching clouds build over the western peaks in patterns that Bear had taught Sarah to read as weather signs. The afternoon was warm, but carried the particular quality of mountain light that hinted at autumn's approach. Soon the aspens would begin their annual transformation, turning the mountainsides into galleries of gold and red that drew visitors from around the world. But this year, those visitors would find a community that had learned to share its beauty without selling its soul, thanks largely to Margaret's strategic thinking and the residents' willingness to fight for something they valued more than immediate profit. "I have something for you," Bear said, setting aside his carving to pull a small wrapped package from his backpack. Sarah accepted the gift with curiosity. They'd agreed not to exchange presents until their actual wedding day, still 3 weeks away. Inside the paper was a carved wooden box, simple in design but executed with the precise craftsmanship that characterized all of Bear's work. When she opened it, she found a collection of small carved figures, each one representing a moment from their relationship: a tiny woman examining a lightning-scarred tree, a man and woman working together at a carving table, 2 figures standing on a mountain overlook, much like the one where they currently sat. "It's the story of us," Bear said, his voice carrying the particular tenderness he reserved for moments when words felt inadequate to express what he was feeling. "Every piece represents something that mattered, something that changed us, something worth remembering." Sarah lifted each figure carefully, amazed by the details Bear had captured in wood no bigger than her thumb. The tiny woman examining the tree even had the same expression of wonder Sarah remembered from that first hike, when she'd begun to understand that damage could be beautiful rather than shameful. "There's space for more," Bear continued, pointing to empty spots in the box's custom-fitted interior. "For all the stories we haven't lived yet." As Sarah returned the figures to their places, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this overlook, this relationship, this life they were building together. 2 years ago, she'd been a woman so afraid of being imperfect that she'd nearly suffocated herself trying to meet other people's standards. Bear had been a man so wounded by loss that he'd chosen complete isolation rather than risk loving again. Now they were 2 people who had learned that authenticity required courage, that love demanded vulnerability, and that the most beautiful lives were often carved from the hardest experiences. Their scars, visible and invisible, individual and shared, had become the foundation for something neither could have built alone. "I love you," Sarah said, though the words felt insufficient for everything she was feeling. "I love the life we've built, the community we're part of, the future we're going to figure out together." "I love you too," Bear replied, pulling her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "And I love that we're going to keep adding stories to that box for the rest of our lives." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they packed up their things and started the hike back to town. The trail wound through forest that was just beginning to show hints of autumn color, past streams that carried the cold, clear water of high country snowmelt, through meadows where wildflowers still bloomed, despite the advancing season. At the trailhead, Margaret was waiting for them with a thermos of coffee, and the satisfied expression of someone who had spent the day working on projects that brought her genuine satisfaction. She'd driven up to meet them, knowing they'd want company for the quota. Walk back to town rather than ending their anniversary hike alone. How was the overlook? She asked, falling into step beside them as they walked toward the main street. Perfect, Sarah said, meaning it in all the ways that mattered. Everything was exactly as it should be. As they walked through the town that had become home for all of them, past the bookstore where Sarah still worked part-time, past the cafe where Margaret had become a regular, past the hardware store where Bear sold his handcrafted furniture, Sarah realized that this was what happiness looked like when you stopped trying to hide from your own story. It looked like small scars earned through learning, like work that challenged you without breaking you, like love that supported growth rather than demanding conformity, like a community built by people who valued authenticity over appearance, resilience over perfection, shared stories over individual achievement. It looked like a life where every mark you carried was evidence that you'd chosen to fully engage with the world rather than hiding from the possibility of being hurt, changed, or challenged by it. Most importantly, it looked like the courage to show every story rather than hiding the ones that didn't fit other people's expectations of how your life should look. As they reached the center of town, Sarah caught sight of their reflection in the bookstore window, three people marked by mountain sun and honest work, walking together through a place they'd all chosen and fought to preserve. Her mother's hair had grown longer and wilder than she'd ever worn it in Boston. Bear's face carried new lines around his eyes from spending time with people instead of avoiding them. And she herself looked like someone who had found her place in the world rather than someone still searching for it. They all carried scars, visible and invisible. But more importantly, they all carried stories of transformation, of courage, of love discovered and community defended and lives rebuilt from the materials of loss and hope. And as her mother had learned, as Bear had always known, and as Sarah was still discovering, those stories were worth showing to the world, marks and all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.